Mayong buntag kanatong tanan. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to be part of this conference. Although I'm not too keen about doing Zoom. I mean, there's no substitute to speaking before a live audience. But this I think is an important conference, and I'm glad that we are having this activity this morning. I wish to start out by speaking about my own experience in relation to the subject of this conference, the Cebuano language. Sometime in the 1980s, I think it was in the 1980s, that I was asked to teach a formal course on Cebuano literature in the University of San Carlos. Although I believed it was a course best taught in Cebuano, I quickly discovered that given my lack of competence in the language, I could not sustain a discourse in Cebuano, and thus, in teaching the course, I had to revert to speaking almost entirely in English. But I knew as well that the problem was not mine alone, but that given our distinctly Western education, we did not really have a ready vocabulary for speaking about Cebuano literary texts without falling back on Visayanized Western terms like simbolismo or imahen, tema, or metapora. This experience led me to design a project for the university's Cebuano Studies Center, which I then headed, to produce a dictionary of Cebuano literary terms. The idea was to go through pre-1900 Cebuano or Visayan dictionaries. Just go through the dictionaries from A to Z and find words that pertain to or were relevant to literary work. Taking inspiration from the example of the monumental Oxford English Dictionary, we would, as far as sources allow, provide data on etymology, use, and for important or key terms, what would amount to a veritable history of the word. As it turned out, the project of excavating knowledge proved to be too ambitious and had to be scaled back to something more manageable but less critical and specialized. Due to the patience and dedication of Professor Erlinda Alburo, 2 editions of the dictionary were published in 2006 and 2009 that included post-1900 dictionaries and broadly included the arts and not just literature. Professor Alburo's important work broke ground, but given the challenge posed by the project, much more work clearly remains to be done. Poring over old Visayan dictionaries and early ethnographies of the Visayas shows us how so much of the Cebuano language has been lost. In the 17th century, Jesuit Francisco Alcina marveled at the riches of the Visayan language, remarking that for the single word, for instance, lavar, meaning to wash, Visayans had probably around a dozen terms, depending on what thing or part of the body is washed. Ligo for the entire body, hilamos for the face, punao for the hands, himasa for the feet, and more. Even a word for a woman washing her private parts after sex, hugab, which the Jesuit Mateo Sanchez in the 1711 vocabulario prudently warns, mahugaw kining nga pulong. Heeding Father Sanchez's warning, I apologize for mentioning it here. But Mateo Sanchez himself lists in his vocabulario 56 Visayan words for different kinds of gold jewelry, attesting to the importance of gold in early Visayan culture for currency, items of adornment, and attesting as well to the widespread practice of gold panning. The loss of lexical items will come perhaps unavoidably when traditional semantic domains become obsolescent owing to ecological changes and conditions of economic and cultural marginalization. In this case, these words need to be preserved even if they are no longer part of the living language, as part of the fund of popular or people's knowledge. Yet other forms of loss can also result when language is no longer used, transmitted, and preserved because it had been overlaid, fragmented, and displaced by more dominant languages. This loss is illustrated in a project translating Cebuano poetry into English years ago. The translator and I, as editor, made the mistake of translating the word bunyag as baptize in a sample of the traditional Visayan poetic form called duplo. I mean, let me kind of quote the verse, the Visayan verse that I'm referring to. Ikaw ang tubig nga matinaw, nga makabunyag ning kasing-kasing, kay gani ang bato sa linaw ng gamot og nanalingsing. Which we translated thus, you are the clear water that can baptize this heart, for even the stone in the pond is rooting and budding. What was missed in the translation was that we did not know that bunyag in its original sense in Cebuano meant to water or irrigate before it was appropriated by the Spanish missionaries to refer to the sacrament of baptism. Hence, we introduced into traditional verse a concept alien for its time, as well as diminished the concrete energistic force of the poem. In another instance of loss, I was writing a paper for a conference on translation. I wondered about the history of hubad, the Cebuano word for translation, and found it translated in Mateo Sanchez's 1711 vocabulario as to unravel or disentangle, as in the untying of a knot or braid, but also interestingly, to solve a puzzle or mystery. Playing with the word, I suspected it is also associated with undressing or taking off one's clothes, hubo, related to the Tagalog hubad, meaning bare or naked. It is only with the 1886 Visayan Dictionary of Juan Felix de la Encarnacion that hubad is simply defined, flattened out as traducir un idioma en otro. Considered in its old meaning, hubad carries a denser, semantically richer sense of what translation involves, rather than a simple transfer from one language to another, which is what the Tagalog word for translation, salin, means meaning transfer from one place to another. Or even the English word translate, which in its Latin root means to carry across. So in comparison, Hubad conveys what at its best the art of translation means. That's why kind of it's kind of it illustrates how the use of a word, say in a classroom situation, can deepen our appreciation for what translation involves. Meaning it's not just a case of kind of finding an equivalent for a word and in another language. So I think more examples of this kind can be mentioned. How more deeply and actually appropriate will it be if you use words like tanghaga, for instance, or larawan, or dugukan, and so on, in speaking of Cebuano literary texts in the local language instead of labeling these items in a language foreign to it. Now, pulling back from these examples, it is important to see the larger story behind the current state of the Cebuano language. The history of Cebuano can be broadly sketched for our purpose in 4 stages. The first is the period of Spanish colonial rule, when Cebuano, with the rare exceptions of religious and pastoral works by European missionaries, was a language distinctly local and oral. In Cebu, a culture of literacy started to emerge only in the late 19th century, with the beginnings of a public school system and the introduction of print technology, factors important in the circulation and expansion of language. In Cebu, the first printing press, Imprinta de Escondrillas, appeared only in 1873, and the first newspaper, El Bulletin de Cebu, only in 1886. Bulletin de Cebu makes for interesting reading, but I've started to go over the newspaper issue by issue, and probably I have already covered some 3 years worth of issues of the newspaper, and I've not found a single kind of recognizably Cebuano author. And this of course, is explained by the fact that it is a Spanish language newspaper that mainly addressed the Spanish community in Cebu. Hence, Cebuanos are practically invisible as writers prior to 1900. No? I mean, except for kind of very rare exceptions. For instance, in El Boletín de Cebu, I came across the name of Vicente Soto, but it is in a tiny advertisement saying that he was selling a piano. But that, of course, does not indicate what he would become. The second period, the first decades of the 20th century, is a high point in the development of Cebuana. It was a time of transition. Spanish, which was never a popular language, spoken by probably only around 5% of Cebu's population, had lost its standing with the end of Spanish rule. English, the new colonial language, was still being promoted. And in the interim, fueled by nationalism, Philippine languages were on the rise. The first Cebuano language newspaper appeared in 1901, published by Vicente Soto, the acknowledged father of Cebuano language and literature. Ang Suga inaugurated what would be called the golden age of Cebuano letters, a period that saw 84 periodicals, whether entirely or partly in Cebuano, published between 1900 and 1940. While mostly short-lived, these periodicals and pre-war book publishing itself in Cebuano indicate a dramatic advance in the development of the Cebuano language. This was the first time Cebuanos were publishing in their own language, addressing an audience larger than one's friends or village, thus breaking out, as it were, from 300 years of literary solitude under Spain. It was an exciting time. Cebuano writers and aficionados were organizing literary and language societies, producing dictionaries and grammars, revitalizing and expanding the language by recovering words that had fallen into disuse, coining terms for new objects, institutions, and ideas for which Cebuano words did not exist, and codifying, standardizing, and refining the language. New words were invented, so kind of many like contributing to the newspapers their own suggestions for new words. Words that kind of never really caught on, such as sukudinit, from sukod init, meaning thermometer, duhagid, duha-ligid for bicycle, and honghongan for telephone. But then there were also many words that were brought into circulation that are still in use today, like hulagway, hulad dagway, for picture or image, perhaps inspired by the advent of photography. There were heated debates over the Cebuano language and its place in a national language, but the declaration of Tagalog as the basis of the national language in 1938 did not dampen at this time enthusiasm for promoting Cebuano. The third phase came with the Second World War. With Japan's aim to Asianize the country in Japan's image, English was deprivileged and native languages encouraged. It was a situation that it to a certain extent favored native languages, particularly Tagalog. And there were pre-war English writers who switched to Tagalog as a medium, like N.D.M. Gonzalez, Jaime C. Laya, because there was no longer any kind of practically outlet for English writing. In Cebu, of course, wartime conditions were such that there was practically no publishing. And Japanese rule proved to be too brief to leave a lasting impact on local culture. With the return of the Americans, the power of America and the English language was resurgent. English language who had switched to Tagalog switched back to English. The post-war period saw the waning of Cebuano and almost complete dominance of English as an official language, the medium of instruction in the schools, and the language of high discourse. The 1950s and the 1960s were the years when Filipinos, like myself, were in the thrall of the English language, such that when years later a visiting foreign scholar asked me why I chose to write in English, I replied, thinking back to when I started writing in high school, that I was not really aware I had a choice. I also recall the novelist Edilberto Tiempo in a lecture on writing here in San Carlos many years ago, telling the students, and I quote, to write in English well, one has to think in English, feel in English, dream in English. It seemed perfectly sound advice at the time. It was only much later that I asked myself, what then shall I have become? The fourth period, the 1960s and 70s, represented a major break in Philippine cultural history. More accurately, we are speaking here of what the scholar Vicente Rafael refers to as the long 1970s, spanning the last years of the 1960s to the early years of the 1980s. For a complex of reasons one cannot fully narrate here, there was a groundswell of interest in the indigenous, the popular, and the local or regional in language, history, arts, and culture. There was great interest in the preservation and promotion of the so-called vernacular literatures and languages that recalled what happened in the 1890s and early 1900s. Rather dramatically, but not inaccurately, students called what was happening at the time the second propaganda movement. That we were living in the midst of a radical cultural shift was reflected, for instance, in what Bienvenido Lombera wrote in 1969 when he said, and I quote, "We are today witnessing our last generation of Filipino writers in English." As it turned out, Lombera's exuberant prophecy did not happen. But this was indeed a time when language, among other cultural concerns, had become a problem, and there was excitement about addressing it. Today's conference tells us that the conversation continues. I will leave it to others to define and speak about what the current stage is. For now, let me just congratulate everyone for coming together to address an important subject. Thank you, and Maing Buntag.
Thank you, Dr. Mojares, for such an inspiring keynote, pointing to the fact that the importance of how language is lost when words are no longer used. And touching on the subject of translation, which is very close to my heart, and how the use of a word can deepen our appreciation for what translation involves. I mean, the act of translation, and I have also fallen prey to the mistake of using a word out of turn. The delightful coinage of words that persist to today. We also have the term lamdaman for lamdag sa panumduman or inspiration. We now proceed to the open forum. I'm sure that all of you have a question or two, so we will take questions from the audience. Please raise your hand, and once acknowledged, introduce yourself and state your question. We're welcoming questions from the floor. Don't be shy. Sige. Asa man yun? Go ahead, Jake. Spotlight si Jake.
Mayong buntag, good morning.
Good.
I don't think I can turn on my camera, so I'll keep it off for now. Doctor, salamat sa imong presentation karon. There you go. Salamat sa introduction to open our conference. Just thinking about the sort of the role that the Cebuano language and Visayan language has in not just in academia, but also in daily life, and how we use it to interact with each other, with communities, with the places that we come from. I'm thinking about language and the role of history, and of course, its contemporary daily life, but also the way that I'm thinking about, from a research perspective, how we could engage with archives where a lot of our history that also relates to documented language can be used as a source for critical analysis, and how we can do this in academia, but also encourage people who are not even necessarily academics to interact with these archives that we have, both at the Cebuano Studies Center, libraries, national archives, so that we can really use it as a critical point of reference to think about uh, about how our history has shaped the way that we even have these conversations, and think about, I'm when I say daily life, because of course you've written about the cities, formations, and so forth, but also how our institutions are premised on a language that's foreign to us, and that we have to do a translation to make it legible. So maybe think about, perhaps I'm thinking about the archive because of my own research, and the depth of knowledge that's in the archive, but also about the contemporary experience of daily life and institutions and politics. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a large question. It's a large question, and I'm not even sure whether kind of, I have a sense that it's something that I need to understand better. The thing is, kind of, for so long as Cebuano is a living language, I mean, it's going to remain vital, and it's going to kind of change in interaction with other languages. So, uh, I don't kind of fear that it's a language that going to go extinct, especially because just the sheer size of the population that speaks it, kind of effectively like Cebuano in the mother tongue of like a quarter of the Philippine population. That's huge. No? So I mean, the problem, however, and I was talking with a Cebuano writer about this recently, about particularly because we were talking about language as a medium for literary expression, no? and uh, and and I think part of the vitality, for instance, of current Cebuano poetry draws from how young poets are using the language as it is actually used as a medium in their work. And so there's a great deal of freshness and kind of in the language itself. But the 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 thing is kind of at thinking about kind of at at that level as well as particular at a higher level of discourse. I mean, how and I think my examples illustrate this. I mean, when you, for instance, have to explain in class kind of a Cebuano text, how you feel, and I think my experience is still quite true for many today, that kind of you fall back on the use of English or actually English just Visayanized in order to accept concepts for which you really don't have the you really don't have the vocabulary. So, but then the problem with using, for instance, kind of words from old dictionaries and attempt to recirculate these words in current conversation because it's a word that's fresh and it's a word that's probably more accurate for naming what you wish to express. The problem is, would you be intelligible to the other person since kind of the word has become kind of archaic? So so I raised this question to a Cebuano poet, and he had a fine answer about like how when he writes a poem, he makes it clear from the context itself, even if the reader is not familiar with the word as to what the word means. So it's a way also to rescuing from being a dormant term to a more active term, particularly if it's picked up by others. And I think the major obstacle to kind of doing that is the fact that Cebuano is not taught in the schools. So, and when Cebuano also is not really a language that is prominent in print, then that's also a problem. So I made reference to how kind of what is important for the expansion of language or the keeping it alive is really alive in the sense that it kind of draws its resource not just from what you hear today in everyday conversation, but probably from literary text and so on. Really, the major challenge is really if a language is not taught and it's not a primary medium for communication. I mean, how kind of language really expand or grow? So my own experience, and I may maybe this will be taking a bit longer than I should be speaking, is for instance, my first encounter with when I assumed as director of the Cebuano Studies Center in the 1970s. And so I became familiar with like kind of old classic Visayan poetry. And then I was really struck when a young writer presented to me kind of manuscripts, his poems that in Cebuano that he has written, which was in a sense kind of a bit of a surprise because kind of young people at the time were not writing in Cebuano poetry. And I was struck by how his language was fresh. And the reason for that is that he was using the language that was very contemporary of young people at the time. So it's a departure from, classical Visayan Ranudo poetry and so on. Kind of this one is very colloquial and kind of drawn from like really kind of everyday speech in Cebuano. But after a time, I realized that it's a language that has stayed in that mode at that level because it's actually the only language he knows. And that's why like kind of an interesting development in Cebuano poetry was when young writers began to seriously study the language itself. I mean, you cannot bank on the language that you already have. You have to like study the language in order to be in a position to draw up from a much deeper resource base than kind of the language that you're familiar with. So, uh, so that's kind of, I mentioned my examples about drawing from old dictionaries is, I think, necessary. But the problem is if if they are not intelligible to people today, then you kind of that becomes a problem because unless you popularize language, you know, I mean, language it also will become purely kind of academic.
Okay, daghang salamat. This could be an ongoing conversation.
Mhm.
Salamat, Doctor.
You know, that's a good question.
Thank you, Dr. Mojares, and thank you, Jake Atienza. Do we have other questions? We have another question from the floor. Parents today would rather have their children be fluent in English. How do we make them understand that being fluent in Cebuano is equally as important?
Mhm. It's an important question. I'm smiling because that exactly is, which is quite common. Even my kind of my granddaughters, you know, kind of uh, are most proficient in English uh, and kind of they know kind of some Tagalog or Filipino because it's part of the curriculum in school, but kind of course, they're not proficient in Cebuano at all. So, I mean, so that's kind of, you know, a recurring question for which I don't have a ready answer. But how do you, when that's kind of part of the educational environment, as well as part of the environment in the larger uh, society, and I remember like kind of how government kind of was concerned about pushing programs in English proficiency because of the boom at the time when there was a boom in the call center industry. So even those social and economic factors are matters that you have to contend with. I mean, not exactly that you know kind of it's not exactly to suggest that it's bad to kind of to learn a foreign languages. In fact, the ideal is to learn as many languages as you can. But it's very important as a base for us to cultivate an interest in learning Cebuano among the young. No? So, like the question, for instance, I mean, because like kind of on one hand, I think what one should not like kind of uh, promote like Cebuano in a kind of exclusivistic position, like kind of put Cebuano and English in as kind of kind of opposing languages, and there was a time like in the 1970s when kind of advocates of Filipino or Tagalog were kind of quite militant about not using the English language, even to the point that like kind of there was the idea that if you write a scholarly article, you should not use as sources English language sources. I mean, so that of course is extreme. I think the contact between languages is an essential, an important factor for the growth of language. So kind of Cebuano can benefit from contact with English and other foreign languages. What is important is that you are able to put Cebuano at a level where it can, as it were, interact on an equal plane with the English language. This is not entirely the case today. But language is, the point that you raised is part of kind of course, a larger question. I think it is important it's really vital for young people to be culturally literate as well. I mean, to know their language, as to know, like knowing their history and so on. I think that kind of should be a basic aim in education.
Thank you, Dr. Mojares. We have another question on the chat box. Good morning, Dr. Resil Mojares. Thank you for your words. I have a question, sir. Which is more important to undertake, translations of foreign text into Cebuano or local text into Filipino or into English?
Yeah, that's I think just what I was saying just a while ago, and that in the matter of translation, kind of it's important for kind of languages to be regarded at a similar level, like kind of not one dominant language swallowing up, another kind of another language. So kind of it becomes the interaction of language becomes most fruitful when there is that kind of parity in the exchange. It's not one language being subordinated to another. On the question of translation, I think the reality is kind of in terms of the direction of translation, and kind of we had an article about this with respect to Cebuano translation, about how like kind of for instance in the relation of Tagalog and Cebuano, there kind of the pattern, the tendency is for the minor language to be translated into the major, for the major language to be translated into the minor one instead of vice versa. So I think if you are going to, for instance, do a quantitative study of translation work in the Philippines, there would be more works in the dominant language, whether Filipino or English, to be translated into the minor languages than for the minor languages to be translated in the opposite direction. So that's, for instance, when kind of there was an interest in publishing so-called vernacular texts And that was a problem for publishers like Ateneo de Manila University Press. If if there's a Cebuano text that's going to be translated, I mean the Cebuano text will be translated to the English or Filipino, but they feel that it's of lesser economic value or importance for Tagalog and for the Cebuano text to be either published or for the Tagalog text to be, but I mean the kind of, it's often the economics, economics of it. So that like if you have a Cebuano text, they would say we'll not print the Cebuano text anymore, just the Tagalog translation or the English translation, because kind of it adds to the cost of translation. So I mean that creates a pattern where, if, as I said, if you do an account in terms of a study of translation, in terms of the direction of the translation, it kind of favors the dominant language rather than what's kind of the minority language. So because they feel that kind of in terms of reach, kind of the economics of it, kind of it's more important to put it in the dominant language than in the minority language.
Thank you, Dr. Resil. I agree with that. And it's really a problem because we have a lot of texts, like for instance, the Cebuano classics that you've talked about. And most of these are not available in book form because they were serialized. And the young generation don't have access to this unless they are part of an assignment or they're asked to do like translation for translation studies. And it's very important for the sense of pride and even for knowing their literary heritage. Do we have any other questions from the floor? All right. So we would like to thank everyone for that engaging discussion. We now proceed to the awarding of the Certificate of Recognition to Dr. Mojares. Rafi. Mhm. Okay. The certificate of appreciation is the certificate is of appreciation is presented to Dr. Resil Mojares as keynote speaker of the conference, The Commonplaces of Our Lives, a Conversation Series, Hulagway 2024, on September 20, online via Zoom, signed by myself, conference convener, Dr. Eric B. Cerudo, Executive Director of the National Commission of the Arts, and Francis Luis Torres, President of In Other Words Incorporated.